Okay, we are going to begin with chapter 5, and in this chapter we're going to cover performance appraisal. There are many aspects of performance appraisal that we're going to be covering, so this lecture will be broken down into parts that'll try and cover the big themes in this chapter. Okay, so just an overview. Like, what are we going to be talking about in this chapter? Performance appraisal is a systematic review and evaluation of job performance. One of the key components of that is to provide performance feedback so that employees, managers, whoever's being appraised can improve and internalize the feedback. No one likes this. I'm so excited for my annual performance review today, said no one ever, right? Like, nobody wants to be evaluated. It feels a little bit like an adversarial experience when you're going to go in and be delivered your performance appraisal. It feels a little adversarial, but it doesn't need to feel like that. If everybody recognizes that it plays a really important role in the life of the organization, it can be viewed as an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to hear about all the good things that one has been doing over the year. It may be sometimes some of you might have had experiences when you went for a performance appraisal and you learned that not only were they very satisfied with your performance, but that they were offering you a raise, or they were offering you a promotion or an increase in responsibility that at least feels like, you're doing more and being given more credit. So sometimes performance appraisal can result in really positive outcomes. Sometimes performance appraisals are times where we can be warned that some of the stuff that we've been doing is not satisfactory. And of course, nobody wants to hear that. But a lot of times it's not a huge surprise to the employee. So it's this opportunity to systematically review the performance and then evaluate the job performance and then give feedback. So the purpose is, one reason why we do performance appraisal is so we can facilitate personnel decisions. We need to have rationale for why somebody gets promoted or somebody gets fired or demoted. When we make our decisions about who gets a raise or who stays at the status quo, these factors are going to be supported by this kind of evidence that would come from performance appraisal. There are developmental purposes, like I mentioned, right? If we find out what our strengths and weaknesses are, oftentimes we can improve. If a company really is hoping that this employee is going to stay with them and they really want to see them grow and develop, this performance appraisal opportunity gives the opportunity for feedback so that the employee can really internalize what needs to be done, double down on the things that they've been doing correctly and maybe expand their behaviors or alter their behaviors in other ways. So if we look at it like that, it's a little bit less threatening to the employee, right? And then we have a very pragmatic reason for it, which is documentation of organizational decisions, right? If you want to ultimately get rid of somebody who is not performing well, it's really, really in the organization's best interest to have quantifiable documented evidence of the employee's performance over time, especially if it's not an employee who thinks that they've done anything wrong or who is willing to change their behavior. If they think that it's all the company's fault or the organization's fault or their manager's fault or whatever it is, they may be contentious if they are dismissed. And so it's really important for organizations to keep track of the decisions, the factors that went into the decisions, so that they don't later get accused of bias or, something else that could leave them vulnerable. So some of the implications of performance appraisal. This is sort of our argument as IO psychologists for why a company should take the time and take the effort to develop really good procedures for appraising their employees. If they don't, some of the bad things that could happen are you could fire the wrong person, maybe somebody who was really a good employee, and you fired them because you went with sort of a willy-nilly sort of how I feel judgment of that person instead of maybe the actual documentation. You might transfer the wrong person into a different part of the organization where they really aren't going to do well. You might promote the wrong person, where you could end up with a person who really doesn't have the skills that are necessary for the new job that they're in, and now you've promoted them. So you don't want to end up with those kinds of wrong decisions. Inequitable feelings. This is a huge risk if, good employees who are diligent and are coming to work every day and are doing a good job and they're responsible and those kinds of things, and then they get a smaller reward than an employee who is not as conscientious, that's going to fuel ill will, and that's going to cause good employees to become resentful employees. And then soon the organization's left with only bad employees. And they're like, what happened? How did we, wait, I thought you were such a good employee. I gave you a raise. I thought all this stuff was going on, but they were making their judgments based on their feelings rather than, documentation. They didn't have a plan before making the judgments. They maybe had some kind of bias while they were making the judgments. And so they ended up with the wrong people getting the benefits. Legal suits, like I kind of alluded to in the last slide, right? If you have a weak performance appraisal system, a person who is dismissed or who is passed over for a promotion or something like that could arguably make a case that you're making decisions based on something other than performance. And so you could end up, vulnerable to lawsuits, even if it isn't the case that the person is being objectively biased or purposely biased. It's possible that it would appear that way if you don't have a system where you can say, these are the things that we've been recording. And then disgruntled employees. When you have disgruntled employees, they do a lot of things that are not helpful to the organization. They don't work as hard as they had been before. When they are given feedback, they just ignore it because they don't trust the source. Or you might have good employees who just quit because they feel like this is hopeless anyway. I'm never going to get anywhere. This is, some kind of group that's biased against me anyway. I'm going to find something else. And if you have a good employee who's quitting, that's harmful to the organization. So what do we mean by a good performance appraisal system? Okay, so it's in quotation marks because, there are lots of different ways to approach a problem, but there are certain characteristics that we're looking at as far as what we mean by a good appraisal system. So first off, ideally it'll be well received by ratees. So this cartoon says, my performance review says I have trouble accepting responsibility. Is that my fault? So we want to have a performance appraisal system that the employees understand. They have a feeling of buy-in, like they understand that these aspects of their job were going to be appraised. This is the result of that appraisal. Like if they feel like it's fair, if they feel like it's deliberate, things like that, if they had fair warning that these were the characteristics of the job that were important, those kinds of things, it's much more likely that the employee is going to respond well to the appraisal. It's based on carefully documented behaviors. So here we have a cartoon and it says bad review. And then the employer says, you suck. Like that is not a good review, right? You need to have carefully documented behaviors. So you can't give a person an overall just generic feeling about how they did over the past year. You have to have examples of behaviors, good and bad, right? Like if you're going to try and tell an employee that these are the things we really want you to continue on with, well, have a list of the exact things that you want them to continue doing. Like these are the things we really appreciate about you. If there are some things that you don't like about how the employee performed over the year, we need to have some specific examples of those, right? So carefully documented, that implies that the supervisor needs to always in the back of their mind be planning for the next performance appraisal, right? So we have to carefully document behaviors. They need to be focused on important performance criteria. So here we have Johnson, get in here. It's time for your performance review. And he's holding a flaming hoop. And apparently this is the critical performance for doing well on this performance appraisal. Unless this is in fact a circus that Johnson works for, I'm going to say jumping through a flaming hoop is probably not part of Johnson's job. The fact that this looks like an office makes me think, that seems like an irrelevant task to ask Johnson to perform. So we want to make sure that when we're looking at these carefully documented behaviors, that they are behaviors that are relevant to performance on the job, specific tasks that are involved in the job. We don't want to get confused by like personality or style. We want to focus in on the things that are important to the job. It's inclusive of many perspectives. Ideally, we want to be able to have lots of different people who are aware of the performance of this individual give feedback about their performance. There are lots of different ways that this can be done, and we'll talk about this as the chapter goes on. But the more people who are giving feedback, the more seriously typically the person who's been appraised will take it, because they'll think, well, it's not just this one person who has a bias against me. It seems to be the consensus. And so maybe it really is something I need to improve on, things like that. Or, wow, all of these people said that I'm doing a really good job. So that makes me feel really like the things I'm doing are worthwhile. And so I'll continue on with those behaviors. And then it needs to be forward looking. The focus needs to be on improvement when we have negative things to say. So here we have apparently one chicken evaluating another, and it says you need to put more passion into your work. And the other chicken replies, but my job is boring. And then the supervisor goes, true, but your boredom lacks passion. So that's a good example of a non-specific piece of feedback. What do you mean by passion? Passion is a really great example of a word that has lots of meanings anyway, let alone what do you mean in this context? I have to say with chickens, a lot of times egg laying, they are quite passionate. I used to have a little flock of chickens, and boy, one of them would lay an egg and would sing her little egg song about it. And so I'd say she had some passion about those eggs that she was laying. Maybe this chicken is just upset because this other chicken isn't crowing enough when she lays an egg. I don't know. But we want to make sure that when we say things in performance appraisals, that they are, ideas for the future. So next time you lay an egg, I'd like to hear you sing your egg song, right? Something like that would be much more specific than you don't have enough passion. So these are some characteristics that we're going to be looking at as far as, performance appraisal types of feedback that we would like to see happen. So I'd just like to finish this segment by saying, no one enjoys performance appraisal. Here we have two people out on a ledge. You're out here because you're supposed to receive a performance review. I'm out here because I'm supposed to give one. Like, neither side really likes to give performance appraisal. I know that school is not necessarily the same situation, but just as much as students don't like to take tests, I don't really like to give tests. It always makes me anxious. Like, did I not teach the material clearly enough? Is it somehow my responsibility? I internalize whether students are able to perform well on the exams that I give. I can imagine if I'm a supervisor and I have to give feedback to my employee, how much I might feel like, well, I don't know if I should mention this or that behavior because I don't really remember telling them that I wanted to see this or that behavior, right? Like, I could see how the person delivering the performance appraisal may not enjoy it. And then also the process of doing the performance appraisal is not really that pleasant for the supervisor either, because like I mentioned earlier, they need to be finding concrete examples, specific behaviors across the entire year. Like, you don't want to have a performance appraisal that is full of stuff that happened in the past week. You want to have this be an ongoing process. And for a lot of supervisors, it feels like a burden. And so they don't really want to be doing it either. And so acknowledging that nobody really wants to be appraised or do an appraisal, that's sort of an opportunity for IO psychologists to develop tools that would make it a lot easier for both sides. Tools that would make it easier for the supervisor to easily log and record behaviors that would be good examples, fill out the form easily, that kind of thing, so it doesn't feel like a big burden from their regular day. And then also that would deliver material in a way that would make it possible for the employee to feel positive about it. So let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back in the next segment and we'll talk about why we do performance appraisal.